So I guess using that as a point of reference, I guess I question, do civilizations ever truly end, or do they transform? Just, I guess, like everything else, is it truly an ending, or is it just a progression into another form? Alright, hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Three Face podcast, joined by my friends Anuraj, Dylan, and myself, Chetan. Today's a pretty special episode. We're about to end the year 2023, and we thought it'd be fitting to do an episode about endings, and endings in a few different contexts, zooming in at the level of the individual and our lives and the different endings we've all been through, whether it's at the end of a job we've worked at, a relationship we've been in, a house we've lived in, or the year that we're all ending now. Endings in the context of societies and how civilizations rise, maintain, and then fall. And zooming out at the highest level of what even are endings? Do endings even exist? So we're going to be covering a few topics. Very excited. We're going to start with thinking about at the individual level. So what does the ending mean in the context of us and our lives, and in particular exploring the idea of death and from a few different views. So Dylan, I think you had a few thoughts on this, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, that's a good start. I love that. Like, just you succinctly wrapped up every particular thing that we want to talk about today. But I think the thing that I want to kind of really stress upon today is basically about the death of man, and in particular all
non-binary.
Tell me. No, but I think the way that I want to look at it is through a philosopher. His name is Soren Kierkegaard, and he's a very realistic philosopher. The way that he applies all of his philosophies is very applicable to the average man, to the average person in that sense. So you can look at what he says and you can practically apply it in your day-to-day routine. But I think what was really interesting about his take was that basically when he talked about endings or death in that front, he talked about the fact that death as a whole, or an ending, is an uncertain certainty. And how we feel about it essentially influences how we live our lives. So whether it may be to experience as much pleasure as possible, to seek something that essentially transcends our mortality, or even if we wanted to make this world a beautiful place or a better place in its rock. The way that our paths are guided and the way that we structure our lives is basically dependent on that universal constant of death. Knowing that there is an end in that front and having our life reframe around that essentially influences the direction, the vision of our lives. And ultimately we have to make our choices to meet that end, and we have to know that we don't know when it's going to come, but if we make those decisions based off that, then effectively we can live a much more harmonious life, and one that's a little bit more in sync with the aims in which we are currently in, the mode and the state that we're in at the moment.
Yeah. How do mind blank to start?
I can jump in. I just had one thought to build on what you were going to say. It seemed like that thought that Kierkegaard had kind of aligned with some of the Stoic views as well, I've heard, about this idea of meditating on your own mortality and your death. And I think they call it memento mori. Yeah, and it's this concept of that creates this urgency in your life that to make the most of it.
There's an Instagram page called Memento Mori, and it literally is just the quote Memento Mori with a black background. Every single day.
There you go. Spot that page.
We're not paid by the middle.
Death doesn't take payments.
Yeah, exactly. But I thought that was a really interesting way to put it, because if you think about it, in all forms of our lives, when we can really be one with where we're at and we can actually distill down the core thing of what we're looking for. Are we just looking for absolute pleasure, just to seek beauty and to be able to experience beauty from every experience in our lives? And I think if we think about when we first started out, that's all we wanted to do. We wanted to just experience that pure form of beauty. And then what happens is naturally, Kierkegaard also actually says that you move from that stage and seek to derive greater meaning, but then in doing so you observe the actual effect of what your actions happen. So like, you observe the impact of your own actions, and that directly leads you to understanding and having this vision to kind of lead it into making the world a better place effectively. You start to understand the impact of what things have been done, and you're like, okay, well, I'm trying to moderate and measure those impacts. And I think we can kind of see that in like everyday life now, where we see like a huge rise in veganism, we see a huge rise in a lot more conscious movements, where we see people just more conscious about their actions because they contemplate and reflect on the actions as opposed to just hedonistic.
The impact that they want to leave on the world.
Yeah.
I think it has to do with the longevity that you expect your life to have. Because I've heard people say you should live your life in two modes, like you're going to live 60 more years and like you're going to live 6 more months. And that has to do with Kierkegaard's two different modes, where you chase hedonism and pleasure, but you temper that with long-term vision and long-term impact on the world.
Yeah, and it's like the idea of like planting trees under with shade that you won't sit under. Like, I think when you go through that path of hedonism and self-pleasure, I think it reaches a point where you realize that your own pleasure and happiness is actually also a reflection of the happiness and pleasure of the people around you. And you can't be happy and independent in isolation if the other people around you are not. And I think that's where it eventually moves to this place of how can I give back, how can I serve the world, how can I help? Because ultimately that comes back to you as well. There's a cause and effect there in that karmic.
Yeah, and on that point, I also want to like emphasize that like, as like his theory is like that most people actually stay in this stage, and we never want to kind of demonize anyone for being a particular person, for experiencing that, or like not being able to transcend that or anything like that, because at the end of the day, a person is a person. We can distill them down as just being people, right? There's nothing.
Would you say that all three of them are important at every time stamp?
Exactly.
Like,
yeah.
Like for example, for a week you could be thinking about serving the world, but on the Sunday or it's a day off, you might want to have some hedonistic pleasure. It doesn't necessarily have to be as negative as hedonistic pleasure. You just want to have fun.
I don't even think it's hedonism. I think it's just purely just being able, when I think about it, it's just being able to act with, it's perhaps it is hedonism, acting without consequence, but perhaps only in the pursuit of pleasure. That is probably hedonism. Yeah. No, but I think the way that I'm saying it is like, what we try to say is like try to distill down the core of the trajectory that your life is aligning you towards at this stage, at this very moment. So, for example, like if you were able to say, for example, if you could strip down all the other thoughts that were going in your brain, strip down every other kind of thing that was going on, and if you could just see where you naturally could move towards and what you think about on a day-to-day basis, those 3 to 4 thoughts that just consistently happen except for the noise, that's where you would ideally want to project your path onto. For example, like if I use a personal example, it's like, okay, I want to get lean or I want to lose weight. There is a purely hedonistic aspect of it. Like I'm not thinking about this has nothing to do with making the world a better place. This has nothing to do with...
You don't think so? I think it has everything to do with making the world a better place.
How so?
Because, like, these activities, they're not just... they don't just improve your exterior, they improve your interior as well. Like, your emotional state is going to be more steady if you manage to do certain things that will keep your emotional state steady. And that will have a counter impact onto the people around you and, like, the things you interact with and the work that you do.
I agree with that, but I think that for anyone that originally, I don't mean like originally intends to lose weight, but the base primal desire of wanting to lose weight is not about a motivated drive to holistically improve society. Whilst you're like, oh, okay, yeah, like, improving that obviously has a carry forward effect of being able to improve like other people who kind of like see it, and then, you have this internal like, better working condition and system which effectively serves society, the initial intention in that front would probably be more towards something that is self-satisfaction.
Yeah, so maybe let's make a distinction on the second order effects that happen to come from our actions, and then what we intend and what is the emotional drive for our actions as we do them. So in your sort of, let's take the case of someone trying to lose weight. If they want to lose weight because they just want to feel good about themselves and they want that exterior validation, then it may have that hedonistic end in mind when the person starts that activity. And the second order effects of having a better emotional state, having I guess the second order effects of discipline and impact, them affecting the rest of the world, that is, we disregard that for now. We only, in this situation, the state of mind or the state of being that you are in, one of the three, either the hedonistic, the serving the world, or they just completely become a recluse and you let go of all these attachments. It depends on what the individual is thinking about when they're performing these actions.
Yeah, I think the framework that I'm kind of talking about is that the person, like, and I'm generalizing this in this main frame, but a person, and for the general populace out there, the initial intention, perhaps when you seek to lose a large amount of weight for the sake of that, is purely for the end result of what it might yield for you in the physical, like, oh, I look like this. And that's what I'm trying to say, is that, like, the pleasure that you derive is from the end result. And I think that, like, that's how a person who is strictly in this phase looks at their life, where they're like, okay, I'll put in all this hard work. The hard work isn't so much so looked at or valued in that sense. It's more, what do I have to do to get to this place? It applies for everything. What do I have? How much do I have to sacrifice to get to, saying, being in this particular position in the corporate ladder or in any particular job? It will give me a profound sense of pleasure from being in this position. But then more often than not, I think, tracking back to, like, any person who's achieved those goals and done those things, that becomes your new base, that becomes your new equilibrium, and you don't derive that all-ending pleasure that you seek from that pursuit, from the goal itself. It becomes like that change to
that's
become
the ending that leads to the next beginning.
Exactly.
Which is a different state of, different way of leading life.
Sometimes I wonder then, in like the like when I think of like the moving to the next stage about thinking about your impact and your actions, you're changing from it being a goal-oriented process to a process-oriented process. Because effectively, you're now looking and valuing the fact that, oh, I'm not seeking pleasure from actually achieving the goal, I'm seeking pleasure from doing the work that achieves the goal.
Yeah, I think it sounds like jumping between the two states, what really changes is almost acceptance and love of where you are today. I think when you're at a point when you, like, whether it's in the context of, you know, relationship, work, body, all these things, where you can look at your life today and just be happy and satisfied with what you have, not having to reach out to all these additional goals and places to find that pleasure and happiness. You can get all the pleasure where you are today. Then you can start thinking about, okay, well, I'm fulfilled. How can I kind of help others reach this as well? Until then, you're kind of just reaching.
Don't you have to go through?
You have to go through that journey. Yeah, absolutely.
So once you get to a place where you're like, okay, I like this steady that I'm on. Now I can think about others and not think about me.
I think so, but I think it's more about.
I'm not talking about, like, there's never an element of thinking about others.
Yeah.
I'm saying that the component in which that element is big, it's a smaller component, where you're thinking first about yourself. So, for example, if someone is like proper depressed, they're proper like unhappy about various different things, relationships, money, income, like personal relationships with family.
They won't have the capacity to start serving the world at the moment.
Exactly.
They're still working to that first
They need
phase.
to tap into that hedonistic, like, no, this is not okay.
Exactly. So you do need to
themselves.
pursue that kind of self. But I think to reach a point where you do love yourself and accept yourself for who you are, and then I think once that chapter sort of ends, that's when you start thinking about, you know, your cup is kind of full, and it's like, how can I help the people around? I do want to kind of, I guess, zoom out a little though, because I think we're kind of going to this like self-growth aspect, but the thing you kind of brought this up in the context of was Kierkegaard, and these phases of life. So how did he relate this to that concept of endings? Was it more that these are the three chapters of your life and one ends and the next one starts, or were they more kind of continuous, and as Anuraj was saying, they kind of all occur at the similar points in your life? Or
I think he didn't really give out like when does this happen for each person.
I have a pretty interesting take on the when. So if we split Kierkegaard's into 4 and we add a section 3, which is new, in which you reflect between your impact on the world and you sort of letting things go, like a letting go process before you finally get to the let go on process. It's very similar to the ashram system that like traditional Vedic society has. When you have the first one where you're just a student, the brahmachari ashram, then you have the grihastha ashram, is when you have a family or a householder. The third one is vanaprastha, when you like start letting go and you let go of like the actual society, and the fourth one is sannyas, when you fully let go of all attachments and you're ready to just bid the world goodbye. Like in the beginning, you've built yourself up. In the householder stage, you're giving back, you're creating a family, you're creating value to society. The third one, you're saying, okay, now I'm giving my responsibilities away. And the fourth one, I'm not concerned with the world.
You like satisfy your duties, you do the hard work and do that, and then you've kind of done that, and then society is like, yeah, thank you for your service, you can go, just transcend.
Do whatever I want.
Yeah. Is that kind of aligned with Kierkegaard's view of how he sees the journey?
It's like one to the next to the next.
Yeah, in that sense, yeah, it embodies that perspective. Yeah, pretty much to the degree. Like he's like he said, like the entirety of life is structured around death, and I feel like my own take on Kierkegaard's concept is that effectively when we are able to like reconcile the interior with the exterior, and the exterior does effectively like fade in relevance, that's when effectively the interior becomes just death in itself, or like ending in itself, you know.
So you're always just preparing for death, and your preparation for death almost dictates your actions in the present.
Kind of work backwards from the end goal.
Yeah.
I think that it's a good way to do it. And I actually I looked into Kierkegaard's, I think the work you're referencing, the sickness unto death. I think what my takeaway from it was, it seemed like it kind of aligned, because he was kind of a Christian existentialist, right? So he kind of drew from that body of work, and I think how he made it out to be was, you know, you need to kind of really think about death to give your life meaning. Like a lot of philosophers, I think, around his time were shying away from that concept. But he became the first existential philosopher. That's kind of what he's called, because he really went into death and really explored that, and what does that mean. And I think he drew a lot from Christian theology, like kind of a lot of his work referenced, like say Lazarus, who Jesus kind of brought back to life, and thinking about, well, what does that actually mean? Does that, in that case, like, does that take away from his life, like which, you know, we say is like so meaningful and precious because it's finite? But in his case, if death didn't exist, would that make life less precious? Like these are the kinds of thought experiments he played with.
Yeah. He was very interesting in the regard where, like, he had a he fundamentally believed that everyone should have a strong relationship with God, in whatever framework they choose to posit God as being. But it allows them to reconcile the finite with the infinite, especially when you discuss death in that regard. And what I thought was really, really interesting was that when, like, that in itself happened to answer a lot of the questions that an individual has with their own sense of despair or their own sense of life, and answer a lot of the questions that, for example, that we can't find the answers to in this worldly plane. And he even said it himself, like, he was like, the way that the Christian theology kind of describes sin is too simplistic. Like, he says that, like, it's too simplistic to describe sin as being bad, and, you know, the way that it's kind of described, he says there's a lot more, because sin is effectively embedded within the human condition. You can't just basically outcast people as being like, oh, they are sinners, you know, like the way that, like,
we're all sinners.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, and the way that you can just kind of like shelve it. But effectively, yeah, I think and in a take where we kind of like zoom out a little bit and we think about in the context of society and traditions and civilizations that have also gone, we think about like that evolution and how they integrated death, how they integrated endings into today's society, and how has that shaped how we are today, That's a good thing to kind of think about as well. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think just kind of wrapping up that thought is, I think what my real takeaway from Kierkegaard was his message about the acceptance of death. It's like he was really kind of, I think the message was, it's not something to be feared. The thing we should fear more is like the inability to die, because that would, again, just take away from what makes this life so meaningful. So
yeah, you could always do something tomorrow. You could always do whatever it is that you need to do
Or
tomorrow.
just-
Or later, or 10 years later, or 100
exactly.
years later.
Or to effectively stay the same, because all each individual desires to be is to be a different version of themselves. And so that was his philosophy. It's like, you can find that.
And it kind of aligns with kind of the Buddhist view of impermanence and nature. Like everything rises and falls, and when we have this attachment to whatever it is, whether it's, again, relationships, a job, a house, our life, eventually it's going to cause suffering when that thing falls. So it's about that acceptance today that, hey, I am a mortal being and I will die in maybe the next 80 years or 90 years. And that's okay, accepting that and working through the emotions that creates, but really moving forward with the clarity of that information to make the best decisions for me today.
Do you think you have to be a certain age to start thinking about death? The people who start thinking about death earlier?
Today is the answer.
I think like from a like kids don't think about death much.
It depends on life
Depending
experience.
on their life experience, obviously, but considering that you've grown up in a society that people don't just die often, like we're not in a war zone or something. It's entirely different for people who have led a very different life. Is it advisable for, when people talk about the innocence of youth, is the innocence almost people, the youth not being aware of their impending death? It's like, oh wait, like this is gonna go on forever. That's
fear,
the innocence.
Yeah. And there's that fearlessness that they have.
Yeah.
And that can be a good thing, because that can take them, like, take risks and do crazy things that as adults we become more closed up and afraid.
Because we know of the consequences.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question, because it's like, should we give them that reality check when they're young? And
because having the reality check means that you can think about your life in its entirety.
Yeah, but again, it can take away from that phase, which can also be beautiful. So I don't know, actually,
I think the system of the system that we currently exist in is that like naturally life does do that. We just seek to protect that innocence for as long as we can, for our future generations and for the way that life continues. It's just that life is constantly in battle to wreck that innocence.
Yeah. I agree with you. Eventually, life will play its cards,
Yes.
and every individual will have to react.
Mm.
But going back to the death of the individual and everyone looking like the endings and going on to new beginnings.
I think there's a really interesting quote about it. I'm not a quote, but it's like it's something I've thought about for a while. Is in Harry Potter. I'll give it a weird quote. But J.K. Rowling has this really interesting way of being able to integrate like metaphors in book form.
Yeah.
But there's this scene where basically Harry needs to go to not the room of requirement, but he needs to go to the room of requirement in the Ministry, which has an orb.
Yeah.
But in order to transport himself there, he has to find a way, right? But effectively, in the start of the book, he's able to see something that no one else can, which is the Thestrals. And the Thestrals are effectively only viewable by people that have actually seen death. So it's only him and Luna Lovegood who's like basically tells him, tells him like, oh, like you, like I can see death.
Is this
like,
the fifth one?
I think so. Yeah, the Half-Blood Prince. I think
That's the sixth one.
Is that
The Half-Blood Prince is 6. Yeah.
Half-Blood Prince is 6, yeah. I always confuse that with Order of the Phoenix. But anyways, so the point is that like Luna Lovegood's like to him like, oh, like I can see death. I can see Thestrals because I have seen death. Like my mother like died. I can see that. And what's really interesting is that when they're lost in the forest and when they're lost in the middle of everything, they were able to use these thestrals which flew them to the room of requirement in the ministry, and allowed them to basically enable them to get to the next stage, which I thought inherently is such a powerful metaphor for our ability to see death, where it allows us to transport ourselves to being able to get to a new place, which is
The room of requirements, like
Yeah.
it's what you need.
What you
need.
require. Yeah.
And it gives us so much meaning and purpose to life, and I think that's what I thought is like, oh, it adds depth, texture, and light.
Damn, bro, I'm gonna have to watch the movie.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and I think it's a really good point in there as well, that the people who have experienced death, like of loved ones and things like that, probably can think about their own mortality much more. I guess they can picture that much more compared to someone where death is just a concept. You know, when you've had a close friend or family member or someone you know who's passed away, the idea of your own mortality becomes a lot more tangible and almost easier to tap into. And it's kind of almost like it can be a way of kind of almost reframing having a loved one pass away, like almost a place of gratitude that, like, I know that this sucked and this relationship was over and, you know, there's a lot of love and things I'll miss, but at least it showed me the mortality of life and kind of reminded me about my own mortality.
Yeah.
And kind of, I'm thankful that I can now go forward and live a life that.
Yeah, I think that death, to put it really succinctly, death gives you a new flavor of life.
It does. That's exactly what I was going to say. It sort of slaps you in the face, and then for a little while, after you've experienced something like that, you see the world a little differently. But it's not long before
You forget.
you forget.
Memento mori.
Yeah, it's not long before you forget. Like, I mean, I'm not trying to say that like death needs to happen around you all the time, but it's important to sort of, if death does pay you a visit, not you directly, try and remember the visit, I guess. Try and remember how you felt afterwards, because that's really the flavor of life that you're almost looking for, because you have gratitude for everything around you. You think about your life, you're like, oh wait, I'm gonna die too. Everyone I know is gonna die. Probably if like you're thinking about family and stuff, probably before me. I need to cherish these relationships and like interact with them with less entitlement and things like that.
I think like you said, I think it gives you a stronger why at the end of the day. Like that gives you enough purpose. If we akin it to the Harry Potter kind of thing, it effectively gives you enough drive to be able to develop a stronger why, and then your vision becomes a lot more tangible in that front.
Yeah, and I think to generalize as well, like we've been talking again endings in the context of death of the human life, but I think these same points are applicable to the death or ending of any other chapter or phase in our life.
Yes.
You know, when you go through a breakup, I feel like it's similar kind of things that you go through, and it's like the grief and the attachment of working through something. But again, it's kind of a reminder of the beauty of love. Like I think love wouldn't be as awesome a thing if it wasn't so sitting right next to the grief of losing love. You know, it's just that reminder of you know how good love is when you kind of lose that as well. And same with a good job or a house or whatever it is. So any kind of ending, I think it can be a reminder of the thing you had and give you gratitude for that, which you can then continue to practice in your next beginning, in your journey forward.
If you choose to see it that way, and which is what you should do.
Yeah. So reframe your.
Because you can become a proper nihilist about everything as well. Like,
Yeah.
That's the meaning of everything. Everything's gonna die.
Exactly.
All things start just so they can end, and it makes you completely inert, and you have no motion within you or around you, and so you become very.
It's a very dangerous perspective.
Yeah, it's a dangerous perspective.
I think people think
Wouldn't really recommend
if
it.
people don't realize it's not a 0 to 0. It's like it's always like there's an opposite. If nothing has value, everything has value.
Yeah. I think we're getting into the idea of thinking about perspective and how that affects what exists and what doesn't. I think it's probably a good segue to what we're going to talk about next, which is about civilization and how perspective and perception shape civilization and the fall of it. So maybe we'll take a little quick breather and we'll we'll get back to you shortly.
Big breath, a lot of topics. We'll be back.
See you.
Oh, guys, I don't think it recorded the audio.
What do you mean it didn't
What do you
record?
mean? With the entire
I-
first section is not recorded.
I don't think it recorded.
See, look.
Just check again. Check again.
Yeah, check once more.
Please. I only want good news.
So on the good news, we recorded the video, but
So we have no audio at all? Or do we have any audio?
Okay, guys, look. We can look at this in a very negative way. Yeah, sure, we just lost a lot of audio content and the files it's gonna sound really bad, but hey, let's accept the situation. This is the ending of something we had an attachment to, and the best way to move forward is by
Mama, I love you.
Anyway, so welcome back. We were just talking about endings in the context of humanity and our lives and the different chapters we go through and the end of our lives too. Now we're going to zoom out a bit and think about endings in the context of groups of people or civilizations.
Communities and society.
Communities and all scales, really. Like it's hard to say what a civilization is, but even like three of us here, are we a civilization? Could this be one?
Definitely not a
I mean, why not? We're civilized people.
I
to
think-
some degree.
I think so. A good way to think of civilization is you need a set of laws, you need some cultural traits that are common across a vast scale of people. So one community doesn't make a civilization. 200, 300 communities that have something in common, that have a shared history, that have a shared memory of a collective, that makes a civilization.
We could make a civilization.
We could make a civilization. We just need a lot of girls.
So you need true. So you need some sort of common like identity, is what you're saying.
There is an element
And-
of commonality, but there's also an element of difference. And if we think about civilizations in the past, like the Romans and the Greeks were a civilization. The Aztecs were a civilization. They don't exist anymore. There's many civilizations or even communities that in the past that have ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt existed, thrived, and died in in more time than the time between Jesus and today. So ancient Egypt went for like 4,000 years, and all of that happened before the time between Jesus and today. So all of our recorded history, a lot of our like understanding of what society is, all our literature that we have, most of it anyway, not all of it. Egypt existed, thrived, and died before all of this even took place. And so I guess the question I want to ask you guys is, sure, individuals grow, evolve, and there's some levels of endings and there's some endings that are not quite endings. To what level is a civilization something that... To what level is a civilization not just something physical, but it's also a little bit ephemeral? Civilizations exist in the minds of the people that identify with them. There's no ancient Egyptians around, but there's the pyramids.
Yeah, I think it's like that idea that you die when the last person remembers you, and when you're no longer remembered, that's when you die. The idea of you is dead, and it's kind of similar at a civilization level. Like the Mayans, they're no longer around, but we still talk about them. Their imprint on the world is still there, and for that reason, are they still alive in some capacity, or has it truly ended, or not? And when the last person kind of remembers them, is that when they officially that's ended?
There's different types of endings, I'd say. So there's the end that occurs when there's no more people left to identify with it, and there's no more creation happening from within. Then there's the end that is the physical decay, and then there's the end that's when no one even remembers them at all.
So is the concept of a civilization dependent on the individual to hold on to those beliefs
I think so.
continuously despite like external circumstances?
I think so. I think a civilization has to exist in two things: in its practical elements, like the laws, like the rules that individuals sort of hold themselves over, societal rules. Then there's arts and culture, architecture, consciousness, like various different takes on consciousness. But then there's also collective memory. So there are certain things that only certain communities celebrate in the world, and they do so because they have a collective memory. And when this collective memory dies, that tradition, which may be part of a civilization, it may not be, that also dies.
I think on that note, I think that, like you said, like some parts of those civilizations do evolve and do change. I think the thing that needs to remain constant is what is the unifying concept that powers this civilization, and is this something that will seek to sustain the civilization past the period they're in? For example, like Spartans.
Yeah.
What is the unifying concept of what drives the Spartan society or the Spartan civilization at that time?
Fighting in underwear.
Man, I feel like we should go back to
gladiators.
Everyone talks about the Roman Empire, but why not about the Spartan Empire? You know, we should. Definitely
Never really had an empire. But,
yeah,
debatable.
But I think it's interesting when we talk about, say, for example, civilizations that have essentially evolved and have like lost its value in today's tradition, in today's context.
Yeah.
Like what like why did they effectively lose it, and was their core concept not strong enough, or was it not about, did it not relate to the individual on a personal level, because it needs to be an extension of that. Society is an extension of the human being, right?
That's right. What were the ideas that were across these various communities that made up the civilization? What was the unifying link, and was that unifying link not strong enough to help the individual through their transition through the different phases of their lives? That could be one reason, like a lack of internal strength on a societal level. Another reason civilizations die is just a big change in geography. So
yeah, I found it online. It said the kind of common causes of why civilizations fall. It's like there's natural catastrophes, so the physical aspects, war, pestilence, famine, economic collapse, population decline or overshoot, mass migration, or sabotage by rivals. And what does that fall actually look like? What does that ending look like? There's often a revert to a more primitive state, so kind of just shrinking down to be a level where it's no longer a civilization, it's just communities, and tribals and things like that, or being absorbed into a stronger society. So kind of, yeah, if it's kind of a conquest or something, then it's kind of being part of that new thing, or just completely disappeared. And particularly when, a volcanic eruption happens or something, and then just everyone dies. So I guess using that as a point of reference, I guess I question, do civilizations ever truly end, or do they transform? Just, I guess, like everything else, is it truly an ending, or is it just a progression into another form? And whether that means, for example, that civilization is no longer a physical thing, but now it's an idea. It's the ideology of what the Mayans or the Spartans or the Romans stood for, that someone could still embody today, and they could still follow that ideology and that way of life in a way, and in a way keep the essence of that civilization alive, even though it doesn't, that government and the establishment of that society is no longer around.
Are we making a mistake in that case of retrofitting what we think the essence of the civilization was by adopting certain elements of it? So my answer to that is yes, civilizations do die. And it's primarily because that unifying essence that held it together broke, and the communities that made up that unifying essence were no longer able to rebuild in the face of some of these things that you talked about: war, getting absorbed in within stronger civilizations, getting being unable to recover from traumatic climactic events. Climactic? No, not climactic.
Anticlimactic?
No. Climactic is like got to do with story. I mean like climate related big events.
Anticlimactic
like
change.
rivers drying up and stuff, like
Mm.
massive tsunamis.
Which we're probably going to see a lot of in the next
Yeah.
coming years. Like this whole, the island that's going under near Australia, I can't remember the name, but they're looking to make it virtual or something to kind of preserve it
Yeah.
and keep that civilization alive in a way.
Mm.
And that's it's an interesting idea, because like in that way, when you fully digitalize an island and a lot of its traditions and customs and put it into that world, is it still alive then? It's no longer physically alive, it's underwater now, but does it still live on? And if the people say relocate to another place and maybe disperse and you know, it won't be the same, but you could say it's fallen, but maybe it's evolved.
I have a kind of counter thought to it. I think about the concept of, say, preserving a civilization, but preservation as a whole. I'm just thinking about this. Is preservation a selfish thought in that sense? Like when we seek to preserve something that's dying, is it a selfish thought?
I think there's a sense of attachment to that thing, but it doesn't necessarily have to be for self-motivated reasons, does it?
If you are seeking to preserve something, there is, regardless of, say, whoever is doing it, right? There is an inherent, like you said, there's an inherent attachment to it. But I think the act of trying to save something is a first order action.
Mm.
All you're thinking about is survival. All you're thinking about is like, I want this particular thing being
What's wrong with
civilized.
that?
Okay, so what's wrong with that? So in that front, you don't consider the byproduct effects of what saving that civilization could do. So, for example, I'm going to use, like, I know we're talking about the concept of civilizations, but to give you an example of, say, a particular thing. Let's say humans, as a society, we value XYZ pet. Now we notice that these guys are going bordering extinction. So to enable them to survive, we provide them a protective habitat and we provide them means to survive and populate their population. But in doing so, we don't consider their pests, we don't consider their prey, we don't consider the byproduct of what occurs by allowing them to thrive more. We don't consider the entirety of the way that the world operates, because it is a much more complex ecosystem than we potentially think it to be. So in the same vein, so with that, when we think about civilization, so when we think about the survival of, say, a particular civilization and trying to say that, we don't think about the potential death we might be incurring to another particular civilization by trying to save one particular thing.
Is that necessarily true? I suppose in the context of saving an animal and then fabricating a habitat for that animal, which then disrupts the habitat of other animals, if you are preserving traditions, if you are preserving your own traditions and they don't really impact the traditions of, say, the other, whatever you want to classify as the other, then you're not really disrupting any organic process. You're just maintaining an organic process. And to answer your question, I think preservation is second to creation. So that doesn't mean you need to create a new civilization. It just means within the same civilization, like, culture doesn't become stagnant. The laws don't become stagnant. The arts don't become stagnant. So when people stop producing in the sort of axiomatic things that you might agree on, this is, very characteristic of this part of the world, like this is that civilization. When people stop producing and creating new things within that context, then you get to the stagnant stage. And once you get to the stagnant stage, then you fall prey to being taken over by someone that has a bit more that creative energy, that like not anxious, but like a bit more fiery type,
The hungry for
hungry for more type
Interesting.
civilization.
So then in that sense, like, if you then, I think that's important to kind of then distinguish, like, which lines do we draw preservation at? Because, like, if we're preserving, say, a 900-year-old tradition, right, but the relevance of that tradition in today's society, is completely, like, not even in the, like, smallest of axioms, smallest of, like, bylaws of the world is anytime relevant, then in that front, like, is that something that, like, you should kind of continue to preserve or continue to do it? And my thing is that there is a direct connection to the ideology of what the civilization operates to, and that is the self-sustaining source of that, then absolutely. But if it is like an ancillary or a secondary, or it's not in any way tied to, like it's been created as a function of the systems that are created, you know, it's not really those are it's like the excess fat that needs to be trimmed before you can get to the real source of it.
Have you guys come across the concept of decoloniality?
Oh, decolonial. Yeah.
So coming from a pretty, I guess, violent period of human history, the colonial period, where like you could simply say that a stronger civilization in some sense decided to go to other parts of the world and spread their ideas, and in the process, you know, take economic benefits and stuff that came with it. Now that we're past that, societies that then survived this onslaught have been trying to understand the contemporary world and also bridge it with the civilization that they remember, that they have in their texts, that they have in some of their traditions. And this element that you just talked about, like what exactly is it that we're trying to preserve, and which one of these traditions are even relevant to today? That is the concept. That is where the topic of decoloniality kind of comes in. And because you want to ask yourself, what is the line? What is the line at which you want to start being? What you want to say that this is the line in which we were pristine before this, and then we were attacked or we were taken over, and then from this point onwards, any additions have really changed the fabric of the society in a way that makes it very strongly antithetical to the original, or it makes the survival of the original difficult.
I find that with this idea of preservation, so I think there was a few elements of what you said in the start. So firstly, is preservation motivated by selfish reasons, or can it be selfless too? I think it can be both. I think if it's our own culture and civilization, you know, it probably is like a sense of, you know, just self-propagation, and I want to keep my own identity alive. But I'm thinking even other cultures and other civilizations, I feel like that idea of what Anuraj was just saying, like there's knowledge and truth in all philosophies, right? And I agree with your point. Some of it might be outdated and not relevant, but I disagree that all of it is. And I think there will be some aspects which are universal and still relevant to today. And it's part of it is like we need to figure that out. We need to figure out from all of this wisdom that was collectively, you know, come up with, what is still relevant for today's world that we need to hang on to. But I think that takes time, and that process requires us to have all of that information to work with. And so part of that preservation is to we need to keep this stuff around so that we can figure out what's needed.
Yeah, for like the first stage has to be like an audit stage. Like what is there? What is it that we remember? Collectively, what is it that we remember? And then some people, subject matter experts, have to go in and be like, okay, this doesn't seem like there's any relevance to this. And then
but is it for subject matter experts to decide, or is that like because everyone can discover things for themselves, right?
I feel like what we're kind of saying is like there needs to be independent people that kind of do this. But I feel like the reason why I raised up this preservation message was because it's a Darwinism kind of theory basically, and his philosophy is like, it's survival of the fittest. Essentially, you just allow nature and you allow nurture to just operate in their forces as it is, because people will inherently do the things that they will do. But
isn't preservation part of nature? Like to preserve your own life, and say by extension the lives of the people that are closest to you, and then your identity. That is an act of nature as well.
It's an act embodied within the individual self, which is why I'm saying is that like. What I'm saying is like the act of doing it is in itself like selfish, right? But it is part of who we are, as what we do. Like in every form, in every entity that exists, we do that to varying degrees. What I'm saying is like the way that we like, I think the way that I'm kind of like framing it is more in the context of like, if we inherently do it, is there a need to explicitly like do these things like you mentioned, where it's like audit it and do it? Like as a society, we will collectively decide that based on where we're at, we don't need XYZ particular things. And as a society, we decide that, because, for example, if we use the English example, like, we don't need this particular type, or we don't need to spin this particular type of cloth because it won't yield us particular benefit.
Okay, but like spinning the particular type of cloth is still like subject matter like you need that level of artisanship to understand the different nuances between the strings and the types of materials that are used and the tools that are used to build the cloth. But for example, if no one taught you the importance of calculus, you might think calculus is useless, but someone has to go out there and be like, find value in it and then find current value in it.
I think I kind of get the idea you're saying too, though. It's like the forces of nature do involve chaos, and chaos does involve not everything being preserved, and there is that balancing forces. I kind of think of it in the context of like, in Indian spirituality, that there's these forces of creation, maintenance, and destruction. And it's not a linear, it's a cyclical thing where you need that destruction for more creation to take place. You need to sometimes destroy the old rather than hang on to it for new creation to occur. And I think that that's part of our society we see today, right? Laws and things like that, we repeal and we say, actually, this is not relevant for our time anymore. And that's how new creation and progress can occur, right? So in some ways, I think preservation can be, can hold us back as well, right? Like, at what point should we actually be thinking about, okay, well, the past is past. Let's focus on today, and not.
There's an element to preservation which is quite closely linked to being stagnant, because you just do as things were always done, and so you don't create anymore.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're probably gonna wrap up soon. So maybe we could briefly touch on the last and zoom out and just touch on the final area we were gonna, which is kind of in the same stream of thought around endings, and what we've just kind of touched on with civilizations is kind of like endings are necessary, right? In the context of civilizations, we're saying for humans to progress, we need to have the fall of civilization, for new ideas and new civilizations to arise, and for humanity to continue to progress, right?
And just with the caveat that like we need some things to end. We don't necessarily need everything to be.
I would argue. I feel like everything eventually ends.
Everything eventually ends, but I don't think that is.
Because what you're saying,
if you then went out to go and destroy, then that would not
destroy, not for this for the purpose of chaos, but for the purpose of progress and creation. Because what you're holding on to today, you probably have a few ideas in mind of where we are in society, of this is the best it can be. But I'm guaranteeing that in 1,000 years, society is going to look very different. And the things you're holding on to today, thinking that this is the pinnacle of society,
letting go is not the same as destroying. Is all I'm saying. Not focusing on something is not the same as actively going out and saying all of this is wrong, and let's end it and start from scratch. That would be.
I think it's more a process of creation and letting go. Yeah. I think and maybe destruction is not the right word to use.
No, there are two forms of destruction. That's what it is. It's just another, it's another expression of destruction. That's all it is. Letting go and whether you actively choose to destroy. They're just two forms of the same thing. But what Chet
I would say one is organic, one is like
one's passive, one's active. Yeah, right. But they're both destruction.
Still,
letting go is destruction.
In still that same vein, I think what Chet is kind of alluding to is the fact that creation, to create new creation is going to occur regardless, and whether we as individuals, we as societies have a stronghold on things like that, we are not the ones who get to decide the end of things. They inevitably occur. So we have to learn to be okay with that as a whole, as a collective.
So
that will build for stronger bases of preservation, stronger forces of creation, stronger forces of everything.
So creation requires destruction and letting go. I think, so on that note of kind of zooming out, I guess the final thing I wanted to just think about is, do endings and this idea of death and finality, does this even occur? Or is all of this just one continuous either stream or loop where all of these are just milestones? Whether thinking from an individual level and a person's life. Like, did that death actually occur? I mean, if we think about the Buddhist or Hindu Eastern philosophies, it's actually not. Even actually the Christian philosophy, the death of a person is just another milestone in their eternal path. They're going to progress onto another life or go to heaven or all these things, but it's not the end, right? The only end, I guess, in the Eastern is the nirvana, where you attain that liberation and you can actually end. That is the only end to that loop. But otherwise, all these other endings that they refer to are not endings, but they're transformations. It's the idea that energy can't be created or destroyed. It's just transforming into another form. And I think similar to applies to civilizations and humanity and ideas. It's like all of these things, if we just think of them not in isolation, that this was the Mayan civilization, this was this, and it started and ended. If you just zoom out and think of it as a tapestry of just human civilization, it's kind of all these threads weave into each other. And one
at the level of humanity, if you look at it zoomed out on that level, then you're not really focusing on individual identities anymore at all. And so if humans are doing something at all, it is a continuation of the human story. I guess if you want to talk about the overall ending, does death even exist? I mean, is there a beginning to the universe? There is the theory of the Big Bang.
I think there is, but I think
there are proposed.
It's so funny that
the
you
heat
say
death
that.
of the universe.
Even as you said that,
the
we're
big
talking
crunch.
about creation. We've come all the way full circle. We talked about death, and now we start from the beginning.
Yeah, I think there is.
From scientific perspective, I was just talking like
from the
Big Bang to either the big crunch or the heat death of the universe.
And I think the scientific definition, the version is correct. But I just don't think it's complete. I think there is a Big Bang and there's a big end. But I think there's more. It's going to be another Big Bang after that one and another big end, right? And that's what the Eastern philosophy is. It's like we're in this constant cycle of creation and destruction, including the universe at its material level, right? So I guess maybe that's the kind of thought we can kind of close the conversation on, is really thinking, we're going into this new year. And really just zooming out, like nothing has really ended. The sun has gone, the earth has gone around the sun. Maybe other way around. The earth has gone around the sun.
Hasn't heard of
geocentric. Yeah.
The earth is flat, by the way.
And nothing really has ended. This idea of a year and all these things, it's a concept we've made up. And maybe one thing we can just do is maybe just reflecting on this conversation, is part of it is reflecting back on 2023. Part of it is letting go and letting go of this year and the successes and our failures, just all of it, remembering and taking away what we need from it to progress forward and create more, but letting go of what's happened so that we can move forward into this, I guess, beginning, which is really just a continuous path on our journey. So thinking of this ending as more of a milestone, as a point to check in as we just keep going.
Yeah, very well put. And let us know in the comments, what are your thoughts on the year 2023? What were your favorite moments in your personal lives? Share with us. And what are your thoughts on death? The individual, the society, and the world.
And of Dylan, because he didn't record this.
I'm still alive
for now.
in the physical sense.
Yeah.
But yeah.
See you guys next time.
See you guys.